Ethan was a young boy, just entering his teenage years, and his father, David, had always been his rock. They had been through a lot together after his mother's passing, and it was just the two of them against the world. So when David met Sarah online and things started to get serious, Ethan didn't know how to feel. He wasn't ready to share his dad with someone else, but he also saw how happy Sarah made him. As the wedding day drew closer, Ethan's emotions were all over the place. On one hand, he was excited for his father to find love again, but on the other hand, he felt like his place in David's life might be changing. It wasn't easy for Ethan to admit, but he was scared. Scared that things might not be the same between them once his dad married Sarah. The wedding was planned in a beautiful venue with white flowers, candles, and all the little details that would make the day unforgettable. Everything seemed perfect. David was beaming with happiness, and Sarah appeared to be the perfect match for him. She had a soft smile and seemed to always know how to make David laugh. To everyone around them, they looked like a beautiful couple, destined for happiness. However, something about Sarah didn't sit right with Ethan. It wasn't anything specific, just a feeling in his gut that something was off. She was polite, kind, and always said the right things, but there was a coldness in her eyes when she spoke to him. It wasn't the warmth he had hoped for in someone who was about to become his stepmother. Every time Ethan asked Sarah about her past, she dodged the question or changed the subject. Ethan had a hard time trusting her. It wasn't that he wanted to be suspicious, but there was this nagging voice in his head telling him to be careful. Sarah seemed too perfect to be real. Ethan began to notice little things that bothered him. She would often avoid eye contact when he was around, and sometimes she'd act distant, as if she wasn't interested in getting to know him at all. It made Ethan wonder if she was just putting on an act to impress his dad. One evening, while they were sitting in the living room together, Ethan overheard a conversation between his dad and Sarah. It was supposed to be about wedding details, but Ethan's sharp ears caught snippets of something else. Sarah was talking about a complicated past and mentioned something about moving on from it. But the way she spoke made Ethan feel uneasy. There was more to her story than she was letting on. Ethan wanted to trust his dad. He really did. But a part of him couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right about Sarah. The closer the wedding got, the more Ethan felt like he needed to know the truth. What was she hiding? Why wouldn't she let anyone into her past? As the wedding day neared, Ethan felt the weight of the situation growing heavier. He didn't know what he was going to find, but he knew that he couldn't just ignore his gut feeling. He had to know who Sarah really was before his father made the biggest mistake of his life. As the wedding day grew closer, Ethan found himself thinking more and more about Sarah. The doubts that had been creeping into his mind for weeks became harder to ignore. At first, he thought maybe it was just jealousy. After all, his father had been his only parent for so long, and the idea of sharing him with someone else was tough to accept. But as time passed, Ethan started to feel that there was more to it than just that. It wasn't just the way Sarah acted around him. It was the little things, her tendency to avoid questions about her life, the way she always seemed a little too perfect, like she was hiding something. Ethan knew his dad had fallen hard for Sarah. David seemed completely convinced that she was the one, the person he wanted to spend the rest of his life with. But something inside Ethan told him to be careful. He couldn't put his finger on it, but he felt that Sarah wasn't being fully honest with them. Ethan decided he couldn't just sit back and let the wedding happen without getting to the bottom of things. He wasn't sure what he was looking for, but he knew he had to find out more about Sarah's past. It wasn't about ruining his dad's happiness. It was about making sure his dad wasn't being blindsided by something he didn't know. One afternoon, when Sarah was out shopping for wedding decorations, Ethan sought his opportunity. He didn't want to be sneaky, but the thought of just letting everything unfold without knowing the truth made him uneasy. He decided to dig a little deeper. He started by looking through some old magazines and papers that had been left around the house. There wasn't much that seemed out of place, but when he came across an old newspaper clipping, something caught his eye. The article was about a woman named Sarah Montgomery. someone who had been involved in a strange situation years ago. Ethan's heart started racing as he read through the article. It was about a missing person case. Her ex-husband had disappeared under mysterious circumstances. The more Ethan read, the more the pieces of the puzzle seemed to fit together in a way that made him feel sick to his stomach. The name Sarah Montgomery kept popping up in relation to the case, and there was a mention of her being questioned by the police. But the article didn't go into details about what had really happened. Ethan knew he had to find out more, so he turned to the internet. He searched for anything he could find about Sarah Montgomery and her past. After a while, he came across an old news story about her ex-husband's disappearance. The details were vague, but it mentioned how her husband had been missing for years, and there had been rumors about Sarah's involvement. Some people who knew her spoke about her in hushed tones, suggesting that her marriage had been troubled, though no one ever confirmed anything. The more Ethan dug, the more he felt that Sarah was hiding something significant. He wasn't sure what it all meant, but he knew that the more he uncovered, the more he realized that there was a side to Sarah that no one had ever talked about. Ethan's mind was spinning with the new information, but he couldn't shake the feeling that his father deserved to know the truth. He loved his dad more than anything, and if Sarah was hiding something dangerous or harmful, he couldn't stand by and let the wedding happen without making sure his father knew the truth. The search for answers had only just begun, but Ethan's gut told him that something big was about to come to light. The question now was, how would he be able to tell his father what he had learned? And would anyone believe him? Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that he was on the verge of uncovering something big, but he wasn't sure what to do next. The more he dug into Sarah's past, the more questions arose, but he still didn't have the full story. It was like trying to solve a puzzle, but there were too many missing pieces. He didn't want to jump to conclusions, but the weight of the evidence kept growing. Ethan felt like he had no choice but to keep digging. The next day, while his father was out of the house on an errand, Ethan decided to press further. He knew it was risky, but he couldn't just sit back and watch as his father made a life-changing decision without knowing everything. He started by going through Sarah's things, but he quickly realized that would be too obvious. He needed to be more subtle, so he turned to her social media accounts. Ethan wasn't a hacker, but he knew his way around the internet. He started with the basics, searching for Sarah's name and seeing what came up. At first, it was just the usual pictures of her with his father, happy and smiling at events. There were posts about the wedding, a few shared family moments, and messages from people congratulating them on their upcoming marriage. But then Ethan found something strange. In one of Sarah's older posts, she mentioned a trip to another city, one that seemed to be linked to the time frame when her ex-husband had gone missing. Ethan's heart skipped a beat. It wasn't much, just a casual comment about a work trip, but the timing was too coincidental. He saved the post, but it didn't feel like enough to go on just yet. He needed more. Ethan began looking through public records, trying to piece together any details he could find. After a while, he managed to track down some court documents. They weren't easy to get, but after digging deep, Ethan found a few pages that mentioned Sarah in relation to her divorce. It seemed that her ex-husband had filed for divorce, citing irreconcilable differences, but the case had been closed quickly. That alone didn't seem too alarming, but the more Ethan read, the more questions popped up. The divorce was followed by a long stretch of silence. No public mention of Sarah or her ex-husband for years. Ethan's fingers hovered over the keyboard as he sifted through the documents, wondering what he might uncover next. And then there it was. Hidden among the legal jargon was a reference to a missing persons report. The case was closed quickly, and the circumstances surrounding the disappearance had never been fully explained. Sarah's name wasn't directly linked to her ex-husband's disappearance, but the mention of her in the report made Ethan's heart race. The more he read, the more the pieces of the puzzle fell into place. Still, he couldn't be sure about anything. The documents didn't offer solid proof that Sarah was involved in her ex-husband's disappearance, but they did point to something being off. Ethan felt conflicted. He didn't want to accuse Sarah without knowing the whole story, but the evidence was starting to stack up. He had to be careful. One wrong move, and he could risk making a huge mistake. Ethan couldn't stop thinking about how this would affect his father. If he told David what he'd found, there was a chance that it would tear their family apart. But if he didn't say anything, he risked letting his dad marry someone with a past that could put them all in danger. His mind was racing with questions. Should he confront Sarah directly? Should he tell his father what he knew? Or should he keep digging for more answers before making a decision? The more Ethan thought about it, the more he realized that this wasn't just about protecting his father. It was about making sure the truth came out, no matter how difficult it might be. The wedding was just days away, and time was running out. Ethan's mind was racing with everything he had uncovered so far, and it was starting to feel like the weight of the world was on his shoulders. He had spent hours digging through Sarah's past, connecting the dots, and finding pieces of a puzzle that didn't make sense. The more he found, the more questions arose. He was no longer sure if he should keep digging or confront Sarah directly. But deep down, Ethan knew that he couldn't keep this to himself, not when the wedding was just days away. He had to talk to his father. The problem was, Ethan didn't know how to bring it up. David had always trusted him, but this was different. What he had found wasn't just a small misunderstanding. It was something much bigger, something that could change everything. Ethan had never felt so torn. He didn't want to hurt his dad, but he couldn't ignore the nagging feeling in his gut that something was wrong. The more he thought about it, the more he realized that his father deserved to know the truth. Ethan finally decided to take the plunge. The next evening, when his father came home from work, Ethan asked him if they could talk. David, always busy with wedding preparations, looked surprised but agreed. They sat down at the kitchen table, and for a moment, there was a strange silence between them. Ethan's heart was pounding in his chest. How could he say what he needed to say without sounding like he was attacking Sarah? "Dad, I've been thinking a lot about the wedding," Ethan started, his voice shaky. "And well, I've been doing some research. I know I probably shouldn't have, but I found some things about Sarah that don't sit right with me." David raised an eyebrow, clearly puzzled. "What do you mean, Ethan? Sarah's a good woman. You know that." "I thought so too, but—" Ethan hesitated. He wasn't sure how to say what was on his mind without making it sound like an accusation. "I found out some things about her past that I don't think you know. Things that might be important. Things that could change how you see her." David looked at his son with concern. "What kind of things? You're starting to scare me, son." Ethan took a deep breath and went on, explaining everything he had found. The missing person case, the legal documents, and how Sarah's ex-husband had disappeared under strange circumstances. He didn't go into too much detail, but he made sure to mention the things that stood out the most: the court records, the newspaper clippings, and the odd silence surrounding Sarah's past. As he spoke, he noticed the expression on his father's face change from confusion to disbelief. David sat back in his chair, his face pale. "Ethan, this can't be true," he said, his voice shaky. "Are you sure about all this?" Ethan nodded. "I'm not making this up, Dad. I didn't want to believe it either, but it's all right there. I think Sarah's hiding something big. I don't know if it's dangerous or if it's just a mistake, but I think you deserve to know." For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The silence between them was thick, like an invisible wall had gone up. David looked down at the table, his hands clenched into fists. Ethan could see the gears turning in his father's mind as he tried to process everything his son had just told him. Finally, David looked up at Ethan, his expression hard to read. "I need to talk to Sarah," David said quietly, his voice steady but filled with uncertainty. "I need to hear her side of this before I make any decisions." Ethan felt a sense of relief wash over him. At least his father was willing to listen, even if it was hard to believe. But deep down, he knew this conversation was just the beginning. Whatever happened next, it would change everything. As David stood up to leave the room, Ethan couldn't help but wonder, what would Sarah say when confronted with the truth? Would she admit to the things he had uncovered, or would she deny it all? Only time would tell. The next morning, Ethan could barely sleep. His mind was still buzzing with everything that had happened the night before. He had never imagined that talking to his dad would be this difficult. He felt like he had just thrown a rock into a calm pond, and now the ripples were spreading further than he could control. He kept replaying the conversation in his head, hoping his father would see things the way he did, but part of him was scared that David might still be too in love with Sarah to believe him. David had told Ethan he needed time to process everything. He'd gone to Sarah that afternoon to have a serious conversation. Ethan stayed behind, pacing around the house, feeling restless. He knew this was a turning point, and everything hinged on what would happen next. He couldn't help but wonder how Sarah would react to being confronted. Would she admit to the truth, or would she deny everything and accuse Ethan of making it up? The hours stretched on endlessly. Ethan tried to distract himself by watching TV, but it was hard to focus. His thoughts kept drifting back to the conversation. The weight of his father's trust, and the potential to lose it, was a heavy burden to carry. Around dinner time, David returned home. His face looked tired, and there was a visible tension in his posture. Ethan's heart skipped a beat, wondering what had happened. He waited anxiously as his father walked into the living room. "Dad, what happened?" Ethan asked, his voice cautious but filled with hope. David sat down heavily on the couch, rubbing his temples. "Ethan, I don't know what to think. I talked to Sarah, and I'm still not sure about everything. She said she had nothing to do with her ex-husband's disappearance. She said he just left, that he had his own problems, and that she was trying to move on from it all. But something doesn't sit right with me. I don't know if I can just forget about what you found." Ethan nodded, feeling a rush of mixed emotions. Part of him wanted to feel relieved that his dad was questioning Sarah, but another part of him felt bad. He never wanted to put his father in this position, but he couldn't ignore the truth. He didn't want to see David get hurt. David continued, his voice quieter now. "I don't know what to do, Ethan. I love Sarah, but if what you found is true, then I need to think long and hard about whether she's someone I can trust. I don't want to believe that the woman I'm about to marry could have been involved in something like that." Ethan could feel the sadness in his father's voice. He knew David had hoped to start a new chapter of his life with Sarah, but now everything was in question. Ethan wasn't sure what would happen next. Would his father still marry Sarah, or would he listen to the doubts that had been planted in his mind? The conversation between father and son became quiet as they both tried to process the situation. After a while, David stood up and walked toward the window. He stared out at the street for a long time, deep in thought. Ethan didn't interrupt, knowing his dad needed space to think. Finally, David turned back toward Ethan, a tired but determined look in his eyes. "I'm going to talk to Sarah again. I need to hear her side of things without any distractions. If I find out that she's hiding something from me, something that could affect our future, I won't go through with the wedding. I won't let myself get blinded by love. You were right to bring this to my attention, Ethan. But I need to be sure before I make any decisions." Ethan felt a sense of relief wash over him. His dad was still willing to listen, and that was a step in the right direction. But he knew that the next conversation with Sarah would be crucial. If she was hiding something, the truth would come out, and there would be no turning back. For now, all Ethan could do was wait. He had done what he could to protect his father, and now it was in David's hands to decide what came next. But deep down, Ethan knew that no matter the outcome, their lives would never be the same again. The following day felt like an eternity for Ethan. The silence in the house was overwhelming, and the weight was starting to eat away at him. David had gone to meet Sarah again, to give her one last chance to explain herself. Ethan wasn't sure if that would be enough. His dad had already heard so much. What could Sarah possibly say that would make everything clear? As the hours passed, Ethan's nerves grew. He knew his dad well enough to understand that David had always been the type to give people the benefit of the doubt. He was a trusting man, sometimes to a fault, and Ethan feared that even now, when things seemed so uncertain, his dad might choose to believe Sarah over everything he had uncovered. Ethan's mind raced as he thought about the conversation they'd had the night before. David had seemed torn. He wanted to believe Sarah, but the evidence Ethan had found was hard to ignore. Sarah's history, the missing ex-husband, the odd silence surrounding it all. It didn't add up. But would David be able to let go of his feelings for her? Ethan wasn't sure. Finally, around late afternoon, the front door opened, and David walked in. Ethan jumped up from the couch, his heart pounding in his chest. His dad's expression was unreadable. David didn't immediately speak, but Ethan could tell something had happened. "Dad?" Ethan asked, his voice barely above a whisper. David sighed deeply and walked into the living room, motioning for Ethan to sit down. "We need to talk," he said quietly, his voice strained. "It's not easy to hear, but you were right to be suspicious. I asked Sarah point blank about her past, about her ex-husband, and what happened. And, well, I didn't get the answers I was hoping for." Ethan felt a lump rise in his throat. His heart beat faster. "What did she say?" David paused, looking like he wasn't sure how to continue. "She admitted that her ex-husband did leave her, but she kept saying it was his choice, that he wanted to disappear and that she had nothing to do with it. She tried to convince me that there was nothing to worry about, but the more I pushed, the more defensive she became. She told me she had done her best to move on from the past, but when I asked her about the missing person report, she got really quiet. She wouldn't look me in the eye." Ethan swallowed hard. The truth was starting to unravel, but it was clear that it wasn't the simple answer they'd hoped for. "So, what now? What are you going to do?" David shook his head slowly. "I don't know. I really don't. Part of me wants to believe her, but another part of me is questioning everything. There's a lot that doesn't add up, Ethan. I thought I knew her, but now, I don't know." Ethan sat quietly, feeling the weight of the situation. His father was conflicted, and it was clear that he wasn't sure what to believe. He had hoped for some sort of closure, some clear answer, but it seemed like they were still in the dark. Ethan felt his stomach tighten as the uncertainty lingered in the air. After a long silence, David spoke again, his voice softer now. "I'm going to give her one more chance to be honest with me. But if there's even the slightest hint that she's hiding something or she's lying to me, I won't marry her. I can't. Not if it means putting our family at risk." Ethan nodded, feeling a surge of relief. It wasn't the resolution he had hoped for, but it was something. His father was still willing to listen, still willing to make sure the truth came out, no matter how painful it might be. David stood up, looking at his son. "Thanks for bringing this to me, Ethan. I know it wasn't easy, but I appreciate you looking out for me. I'll handle the rest from here." As David walked out of the room, Ethan felt both exhausted and hopeful. The next few days would be crucial. He didn't know what Sarah's next move would be, but he knew that the truth was closer than ever. Whatever happened, Ethan had done his part. Now, all he could do was wait for his father to make the right choice. Ethan could feel the tension in the air as the wedding day drew closer. His father had been unusually quiet since his last meeting with Sarah. It was clear that David was struggling with his emotions, torn between love and the unsettling truth that had come to light. Ethan wanted to ask him what he had decided, but he also knew that his father needed time. The night before the wedding, David sat alone in the living room, staring at the invitation in his hands. Ethan walked in hesitantly, sensing that his father was deep in thought. He sat down beside him, waiting for David to speak first. After a long silence, David finally sighed and looked at Ethan. "I've made up my mind," he said, his voice firm but filled with sadness. Ethan's heart pounded. "What are you going to do, Dad?" David placed the invitation on the table and leaned back in his chair. I'm calling off the wedding," he said, his tone filled with a mixture of relief and regret. "I spoke to Sarah again today, and I could see it in her eyes. She was hiding something. She kept trying to avoid the topic, and when I asked her one last time about her past, she got defensive. She accused me of not trusting her, of letting doubt ruin our future together. But the truth is, trust has to be earned, and I realized that I don't really know the woman I was about to marry." Ethan felt a wave of relief, but also sympathy for his father. He knew this decision hadn't been easy. "I'm sorry, Dad," he said gently. "I know you cared about her." David nodded, his eyes heavy with emotion. "I did, and part of me still does. But I can't ignore the facts. I can't build a life with someone who refuses to be honest with me. If she had nothing to hide, she would have told me the truth from the start." Ethan reached out and placed a reassuring hand on his father's shoulder. "You're doing the right thing. It's better to know now than to find out later when it's too late." David sighed again, rubbing his face tiredly. "I just wish things had turned out differently," he admitted. "I wanted a fresh start, a new beginning. But I can't move forward with someone who won't let me see who they really are." Ethan nodded in understanding. "Maybe this is life's way of protecting you from something worse," he said. "Maybe it's giving you a chance to find real happiness with someone who truly deserves you." David smiled weakly, appreciating his son's words. "Maybe you're right," he said. "Either way, I know one thing for sure. I'm grateful to have you by my side. If you hadn't looked into this, I might have walked into something I would regret forever." Ethan felt a deep sense of pride. He had taken a risk by speaking up, but it had been worth it. His father had seen the truth, even if it was painful. Now, all that was left was to face Sarah one last time, and officially end what could have been a huge mistake. As father and son sat in a quiet living room, they both knew that tomorrow would not be a wedding day. It would be a day of closure, a day of new beginnings. And despite everything, they were ready to face it together. The morning of what was supposed to be the wedding day arrived, and the air in the house was still heavy with unspoken emotions. Ethan and his father had stayed up late the night before, talking through everything. The decision had been made. David was no longer going to marry Sarah, but the difficult part was still ahead. He had to tell her. Ethan watched his father as he prepared for the conversation. David was usually calm and collected, but today he was pacing around the house, deep in thought. His face was set with determination, but there was an unmistakable sadness in his eyes. Ethan could tell that this was one of the hardest things his dad had ever done, but he also knew it was the right choice. "Are you sure you want to do this?" Ethan asked, breaking the silence. He stood by the door, his voice quiet but filled with concern. David stopped pacing and looked at his son. "I don't want to hurt her, Ethan. I really don't. But I can't live in a lie. I can't pretend everything's okay when I know it isn't. I wish I had seen the warning signs earlier. I wish I had trusted my instincts." Ethan nodded, understanding the pain his father was feeling. He knew David had wanted to build a future with Sarah, but sometimes things weren't meant to be. "You're doing the right thing," Ethan said. "It might be hard now, but it'll be better in the long run." David gave a small, appreciative smile. "Thanks, son. I don't know what I'd do without you." Ethan smiled back, feeling the weight of the moment. He had been there for his dad when it mattered most, and he hoped it would make a difference in the long run. David took a deep breath and headed for the door. "I'm going to go see Sarah," he said. "It's time to end this once and for all." Ethan watched his father leave, feeling a mix of emotions. It was hard to see his dad go through this, but Ethan knew this was the best thing for both of them. A few hours later, David returned. His face was tired but relieved. He didn't say much as he walked in, but Ethan could tell that the conversation had been difficult. "How did it go?" Ethan asked, his voice soft but eager to know. David sat down heavily on the couch, exhaling deeply. "It was tough," he admitted. "I never wanted to hurt her, but she didn't take it well. She tried to convince me that everything was fine, that we were just going through a rough patch. But I couldn't ignore the truth anymore. I told her that I couldn't marry her because of the things I'd discovered. Ethan sat down next to his father, offering his support. What did she say? David shook his head, a hint of sadness in his eyes. She didn't take it well. She was angry, but also hurt. She tried to blame me, said I didn't trust her. I think deep down, she knew she couldn't keep lying, but she wasn't ready to face the truth. In the end, I told her that I hoped she could find peace, but I had to move on. Ethan could see the weight lifting from his father's shoulders, though there was still a lingering sadness in his eyes. It had been a painful decision, but David had done what was best for both of them. You did the right thing, Dad, Ethan said softly. I know it wasn't easy. David nodded, his face slowly softening. It wasn't, but I feel a sense of relief now. I don't have to live with the doubt anymore. I can finally move forward. He paused for a moment, looking at Ethan with gratitude. And I can do it knowing that I have you by my side. Ethan smiled, feeling a deep sense of pride. His father had made the hard choice, and together, they would move forward. The future was uncertain, but with each other's support, they knew they could face whatever came next. As they sat together, father and son, in the quiet house, both of them knew that today marked the end of one chapter and the beginning of another. It wasn't the wedding they had imagined, but it was a new beginning, a fresh start. And for the first time in a long while, they both felt hopeful about what lay ahead.